Welcome back to another episode of Fulfilling Work, Meaningful Life with Anthony Kraker. This week, we're going to be continuing our discussion about how to stand out at work. But before we dive into that topic, I just want to remind you that you can subscribe to my monthly newsletter if you go to my website, fulfillingworkmeaningfullife.com. And if you subscribe, I will send you a free download for a 14-day reflection journal for finding or creating fulfilling work. This resource is designed to help you in your career transition. If you're not happy in your current employment, or if you're looking to make a change in the industry that you're in, or maybe you're wanting to start a small business or a side hustle, this is a great resource to help you think through what you need to do and to take action towards changing your current situation in your career. So check that out. Again, fulfillingworkmeaningfullife.com. Put in your email address to subscribe to the newsletter, and I'll send you that free download for the 14-day reflection journal for finding or creating fulfilling work. Okay, so just to recap, last week we talked about some principles to help us stand out at work. And we talked specifically about what to do if you're new to a job. So I want to briefly recap those principles, go through what we talked about, and talk about some of the other principles that we discussed just very briefly, and then we'll get into the new material for today's show. So as a reminder, we talked about how if you're new to the job, you need to do 5 things. You need to learn to execute your role with excellence. You need to gain credibility within the organization. You need to be positive and be willing to do whatever is asked. You need to avoid gossip like the plague. And 5, don't start making suggestions or identifying problems at the outset when you're new to the organization. And then after you've done those things and you've kind of established yourself as somebody who is a positive contributor to the organization, then you can start to think innovatively about things that the organization can improve on. And you can approach the appropriate people within the organization to offer those suggestions. Now, when you get to that point where you're ready to start sharing your innovative ideas, you need to think through some things. And the first thing, first and foremost, is you've got to remember that the purpose of a business is to be profitable. So when you come to your boss and you offer an innovative idea or solution, it needs to be something that helps increase the bottom line of the organization. Otherwise, it's likely not to be worth the time and investment it will take to implement your idea. As you're thinking through some areas where some improvement might be needed within the organization, you need to take a look at the systems that are in place within that organization. And then you need to ask yourself some questions. The first question you need to ask yourself is there an area that might be tweaked to make it more efficient? And then the second question is there a change to protocol that could help increase the bottom line while maintaining the quality of the product or service? The third question is, are there tech measures that can be taken to increase efficiency and productivity, such as updating or improving internal software programs or obtaining better hardware or equipment that could be used and that would be worth the investment? And then the fourth question is there a reasonably affordable way to improve employee morale that would result in less turnover and increased employee satisfaction to the point that the employees within the organization become more productive? So those are questions you need to think through as you're coming up with innovative ideas and solutions for your organization that you can offer. And then you need to make sure when you approach your boss that there is a way for them to measure the success of your suggestion. If you can't measure it, it's not worth the time. So that's another factor to consider as you're thinking through innovative ideas that you want to present to your boss or bosses in order to stand out at work and make a meaningful contribution to the organization. So that's a recap of the suggestions and principles that we went through last week. And so this week, I want to continue on with that discussion and conclude with some additional things to think about as you try to stand out at work. The next thing to think through is whether or not the suggestions that you're going to make are going to require significant costs up front. And you need to think through whether or not the benefit to the employer is going to be worth whatever those costs are. So let me tell you a story that I learned about a few years ago. There was a fairly large business, and they had offices in several different locations. And this business had a large number of employees. In one of the offices, the manager of that office had an idea that she thought would be helpful for some of her employees. Not even all the employees, just some of the employees. At the end of the year, there was a meeting, a virtual meeting where everybody was online, and the managers of the different departments, the different department heads, were supposed to share the successes that they had that particular year. And this was a meeting that was attended by everybody within the company. The idea was to help everybody within the organization recognize the contributions that were being made, not only by management, but also by the employees at large, and to show how the organization was being successful in executing its mission. Okay. So this meeting rolls around, and this manager or this department head shared this idea that she had implemented as an example of one of her department's successes. And the idea was to put in a commercial air filtration system into the office where she and her team worked. Apparently, they had one or two employees that had some respiratory issues, and she felt like an expensive commercial air filtration system would help improve their working environment. Now, that was a nice gesture, but unfortunately, it required a significant cost upfront for the employer, and there wasn't a clear benefit to the organization as a whole. It benefited a couple of employees, but it didn't even benefit her entire department that worked in that office. And it certainly didn't benefit the rest of the organization throughout the country. As I learned about this, I was kind of struck that this was a suggestion that somebody would share that they implemented as an example of a success story, especially with the whole company listening in on this virtual call. Not too long after that, this company had to downsize due to some unexpected obstacles that they faced. And they ended up laying off quite a few employees because the company wasn't as profitable as it needed to be. Unfortunately, this particular manager that had this idea for the commercial air filtration system was among those employees that got laid off. Like I said, she had a nice idea. She was thinking of her employees and she wanted to make their working environment better, but she wasn't thinking innovatively. She wasn't looking at the costs. She wasn't looking at whether this idea was going to be successful and whether it would result in increased efficiency, productivity, and profitability. And I'm certain there was no way to measure whatever benefit there might have been by putting this expensive air filtration system into place. So I share that as kind of a cautionary tale. That's an example of something that is not innovative and that's not going to help you stand out at work, at least not in a good way. All right, so you've got to think about, how does my idea benefit the organization? What are the costs? And if I'm going to pitch this idea, does it make sense for the organization to spend the money that's going to be required to make these changes? It has to be an investment that can be measured and that is likely to result in better productivity, efficiency, and more profitability. Additionally, as you're thinking innovatively and trying to identify areas where the organization can improve, you need to look carefully at the data that you have access to. Now, in today's world, everything, just about everything, can be measured, at least as far as the productivity of an organization and the efficiency of an organization go. we have access to just tremendous amounts of data as a result of the technology that we have. And so if you're in a situation where you have access to some data, you want to look carefully at that data and analyze it the best you can. And if you don't have enough data to be able to make a good suggestion to your boss in an area that you think can be improved, approach your boss and ask about the data that you don't have access to. Now, he or she might be willing to share some of that data with you, or they might not. But here's the caveat. You've got to be wise about how you go about doing this. You don't just go into your boss's office and say, hey, can you tell me about XYZ, or can you give me the statistics for this area that I'm working in? You don't just go and say, hey, can you give me this data that I want? You've got to present it in a way that's going to make sense to your boss to share it with you. One of the ways that you can do that is by putting yourself in a position where you should feel comfortable talking to your boss about suggestions. You've established yourself as somebody that's credible within the organization, somebody who's positive, who contributes, who does a great job in their work, that's not a gossip. And if you've done that, you can approach your boss and say, hey, I'm trying to think through a way that we can solve this particular issue. And I'm looking at the data that I have to try to figure out maybe how we can make some tweaks or changes and go about improving this particular problem or issue that we're having. But I realize I don't have all of the data that I need to be able to come up with a suggestion that I can give to you that you can really consider and then decide whether to take up the chain to higher management, assuming that your boss isn't at the higher levels. Would you be able to share that data with me? And then you ask for whatever data it is that you feel is necessary. In some cases, your boss may not be willing to share it, or they may not be allowed to share it. But even in that conversation, you might be able to gain some insight into the information that you're lacking in order to help you come up with an innovative solution that you can later present to your boss as a way of helping the organization. And then once you look at the data that you have, whether it's getting additional data from your boss or just looking at the data that you yourself have access to, you need to use that data to analyze as best you can the business's current performance. And then based on that data, based on how well the business is performing in whatever area that might be, then you want to look for those areas that can be improved and look for ideas to improve problems that you've encountered or issues that have come up during the course of your employment. So look for areas where time can be saved, where costs could be cut, or where revenues could be increased. Look at the data carefully to come up with that idea. Let me give you an example from my own career from a few years ago. And I'm not sharing this as a way to brag or anything like that. It's just an example that I have in my own experience where I came up with an innovative solution to an issue that I identified that my bosses didn't even necessarily realize that we had. So I mentioned that I've been with my firm for over 15 years, and I serve in a senior supervising management role. And right now, I'm overseeing our appeals process for our cases. But a couple of years ago, as I was thinking through whether or not there was a way we could improve as a firm and become more productive or efficient or more profitable, I realized that we had an opportunity that I hadn't thought of before. We had partnered several years ago with another law firm to help us in our brief writing for the appeals that we file. And if you don't know what a brief is, a legal brief is a document that you write that has arguments to persuade the judge. And so we submit these briefs in our appeals, but we had been relying almost entirely on this other law firm to do the brief writing for us. And it was a good partnership, and they did a fairly good job. But as a result of that partnership, we had to split some fees with this firm when we were eventually paid on the cases that we won. So I looked at the data, and even though we had this partnership with this firm for several years, I typically wrote my own briefs for my own cases when I appealed a case. I just preferred to do it that way. I felt like I knew my case better than anybody else. I knew my client, and I wanted to make sure that the brief that was being submitted on appeal would contain the arguments that I felt would be the most persuasive to the judge that was reviewing our appeal. So I had experience writing these briefs, and I realized that there might be an opportunity to sever the relationship with this other law firm and bring the brief writing back in-house. So I looked at the data that I had access to. I talked to my boss and got some additional data about how many overall cases they were doing for us. I looked at how much time it took me typically to write one of these briefs, and I looked at the volume of cases that we had, and I realized that one person could actually do this job if they were really good at it, if they knew what they were doing, if they knew the law, if they knew how to be efficient in writing these briefs. So I approached my bosses and I pitched this idea of having me do all of our legal briefs for those appeals. And I didn't have access to the books to know exactly how much it would save the firm, but I did some calculations based on what I figured we were sharing with this other firm in terms of legal fees. And it ended up being a pretty significant amount that we could save based on my estimates. So when I brought this to my bosses, they thought it was a good idea. They looked at it, and they, of course, did their own math and calculations to make sure that it made sense. And I ultimately got this opportunity to move into this different role. It was a lateral move for me, not necessarily a promotion, but it's been a project that I've been really excited about the last couple of years. And not only have we saved money doing this and increased the amount of legal fees that we get on the cases that we eventually win after an appeal, but I'm actually winning more cases on appeal than this other law firm was. So again, not to toot my own horn, but this is an example of an idea that was innovative, that identified an area where we could maybe tweak things and make some improvements or do something differently than we had been doing for several years, that increased the revenue of our firm, increased our profitability, and also gave me an opportunity to do a different type of work on a full-time basis that I now really enjoy doing. And I enjoyed my job before, but this was a nice change. And I'm really excited about it because it's still kind of a new project and we're learning as we go. And I'm excited to see how I can get better and better at this and not only make more money for my firm, but also make more money for myself, right? And in the process of doing that, do a better job for our clients, because that's what it's all about, is representing our clients well. And in the area of law that I practice in, we don't get paid unless our client wins their case. So I share that as just an example of a way that I thought innovatively in my firm. And whatever industry you're in, there are bound to be ways that you can think innovatively and identify solutions after doing your research, looking at the data, figuring out, is this something that makes sense cost-wise, and then bringing those ideas to your bosses and pitching those ideas in a persuasive way. That can be really rewarding. It was really rewarding for me. And I've been, like I said, with my firm for a long time, over 15 years, and I love the people that I work with. They're good, ethical people, and everybody tries to do the best that they can. So I want to make a meaningful contribution to my employer. That's important to me. And I derive personal meaning from that process of helping my employer, because it helps me to grow as a person, as an attorney, as a leader, and it's just a good experience overall. All right. So as we get to the end of the show today, I want to talk about a couple more things briefly. What happens if your employer isn't receptive to your suggestions? Now, I'm lucky that my firm has always encouraged us to think innovatively and to offer suggestions. But if you are in a situation where your employer or your boss or whoever is not open to hearing your ideas, you have to ask yourself, is it you or is it the culture of the workplace? And this requires a hard look in the mirror. You have to be really honest with yourself. If you're getting shut down and your superiors don't want to hear your suggestions, you need to ask yourself, is there something that I'm doing that is off-putting, something that I'm doing wrong, where maybe an area I need to improve in so I gain more credibility with my bosses and within the organization? And you have to be honest with yourself about that. And you might need to even seek some advice from your peers within the organization or somebody that you trust that can give you an honest assessment. So if it's you, you need to figure out why, and then you need to think about what you can do to improve so that you can put yourself in a position in the future to where you can offer innovative solutions to your boss that can help the organization and hopefully be rewarded for those innovative ideas. Now, on the other hand, if it's the culture of the organization, it might be time to look for another opportunity. Now, I'm not saying go out and quit your job without having another job in place. That would be unwise. But it might be time to start looking and thinking about making a transition to another organization or another department or whatever, to where you can work in an environment that allows you to thrive and to think creatively and innovatively and make a real contribution to the organization. Okay. Last thing, and this is really important. Don't be annoying with your suggestions and don't make suggestions all the time. Okay. If you're the type of person who is constantly making suggestions and bothering your boss with ideas, that's going to get annoying. It's going to be off-putting. And you don't want to be that person. You want to be the person that thinks through solutions analytically and thoughtfully and creatively. And from time to time, you bring those solutions to your superiors within the organization. If you're doing it all the time, people are not going to pay attention to you. They're going to ignore you and they're going to find you annoying. So don't be that way. Don't be that person. Be strategic in how often you approach your boss or bosses with ideas and how often you have those conversations. And if you do that, if you follow these principles that we've talked about both today and in last week's episode, I think you'll find that you'll be able to make a real contribution to the organization that you work for, and that the ideas that you come up with will be helpful. They will increase efficiency or productivity, or they'll increase profitability for the organization. And that will result in you being rewarded for your efforts, for going above and beyond. And that reward may come monetarily. It may come with a promotion and more responsibilities. It may come just in the form of recognition among your peers. But I can tell you from my own experience that when you try to think innovatively at work and you offer real helpful solutions that can be measured and that can make a meaningful contribution to the organization, that is very fulfilling. That's fulfilling for me, and I'm confident it will be for you if you're the type of person that is driven and wants to contribute and wants to make the organization that you're working for to be the best it can be. So I hope you've gotten something out of these last couple of episodes that can help you as you try to stand out at work. And if you have ideas that I didn't mention that you think would be helpful for our listeners to hear, send those ideas to me. Shoot me an email. You can email me at anthony@fulfillingworkmeaningfullife.com. You can also go to the website, fulfillingworkmeaningfullife.com, and there's a section where you can ask Anthony a question, but you can ask me a question or just send me a comment. And I would love to hear from you and possibly share your ideas or your comments or your questions on the show as we continue to talk about how we can find and create meaning in our work and in our personal lives. As always, thank you so much for listening and tuning in. That's all I've got for today, so I'll sign off. Until next time, let's make it a meaningful week.